Welcome to Programmable, where we talk to tech luminaries to help you with your career. Programmable is brought to you by JDoodle, the AI coding suite for learning and building together. I'm Lucas Hakewill, and in today's episode, we're speaking with James Alexander about his journey from student to software engineer to investor. James is co-founder of Galileo Ventures, an early-stage venture capital fund which invests in emerging and first-time founders from their very first rounds. Before Galileo, he co-founded one of the first university startup accelerator programs in Australia, Incubate, at the University of Sydney. James studied computer science, and today we'll unpack how he took his software engineering skills and applied them to a very different career. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me.
First up, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I have an unusual career. I don't think it's definitely taken me off the beaten track. As you mentioned, I actually studied computer science. So I technically engineering trained at the University of Sydney. I actually ended up doing an honours in computer science too, which was really fascinating. I looked at visual language and music visualization in my honours research thesis, which is an area dear to my heart, which I'll probably get back into at some point, ideally. And then over that period, I got involved with entrepreneurship and with helping entrepreneurs. And then I started an incubator, which became Incubate, which became one of the largest programs in Australia, so that we did about 200 startups across Australia. We took it to 5 university campuses, and we can talk about that as well. And then during that period, I developed a thesis around what makes a really, really good aspiring entrepreneur and how to find and pick people that we think are going to be exceptional entrepreneurs that will build really game-changing companies. And so then we launched a venture capital fund. And the reason I think this is a bit weird is because most people don't end up running an incubator or launching a VC fund until they're very successful, until maybe they've had a career already and they've exited and they made oodles of money. But I'm the opposite, right? I haven't had a career. I haven't made oodles of money, and yet I've started all these things. So I think it's definitely the opposite way of how most people would get into this profession. Nonetheless, it gives us a slightly different perspective to a lot of older folk that are in my sector. And obviously now we run Galileo. We've got 20 investments to date. We've made 20 investments to date. We invest globally, but most of our investments are in Australia. However, the founders sell globally, and it's an exciting time to be investing.
So, James, plenty of our listeners will be really interested in this idea of going the opposite way. You don't have to have a long career in investment banking to end up as a venture capitalist. Talk to me a bit about how this changes your perspective and how this changes the kind of investments that you're willing to make.
It's funny because my dad wanted me to study finance in university, and I said, no way, I like technology. I've always been a technologist at heart. And I think being an engineer on the tools previously, and one of my first proper jobs was at a small company, small software startup with about 80, I think it was about 80 or 100 people at the time. So not that small. And that was a company called Atlassian. Obviously, Atlassian is now one of the world's largest enterprise companies. They did about, I think, 4 billion in revenues last year, roughly. And the company is worth many tens of billions in enterprise value now. So, a huge success story. But I got a glimpse of them very, very early on. And I think one of the things, there's probably two aspects that really jump to mind. The first one is an understanding of the product, how it works, is very, very important. And it's really an intuitive sense of kind of like, is this a product that we think is technologically advanced within the space that they're trying to be in, and sort of understanding how it works on the surface. Obviously I'm not an expert on all the architecture, but just a basic understanding is very important. And then the other aspect is the people. And so we typically bias towards investing in technical people. So we love computer science student entrepreneurs, and we love research entrepreneurs. And so I think understanding what it takes, what type of person, really loves to code and really loves to build things gives you a good sense of their potential. And so So those two factors are probably a differentiating factor to me. Other investors will care a lot more about, oh, tell me about your market size, and oh, tell me about your traction, or just look at the numbers. There's like, oh, until you make lots of, until you make $1 million in revenue, I don't care. But for me, I think those things are the last things for me. I look much more at the people and the team first.
So do the team have the capacity to build something, and is the something, I guess, a product that has some really strong differentiation from what other people are building?
Yeah, I think the first one is, do they have the capacity to build? And this is where computer science students have such an advantage. You could build with software, and now with the advent of LLMs and AI, you're turbocharge your abilities as well. The fact that you can build and you can get things out there is such a strong advantage over someone that has to hire someone to build for them. And so I think absolutely, do they build? Can they build? And what have they built? We don't necessarily care too much about the traction. So we call that sort of like where you're at with customers and traction in market. Like we look at a lot about what have you done to date and your speed of execution and iteration as a stronger determination for us versus, how many customers and users do you have right now? That to us is more important.
Great. So you've made 20 investments at Galileo. You've obviously had a chance to test this thesis a little. Tell us a bit about, I guess, some of those investments. What's been the trajectory of Galileo so far?
Yeah, sure. So we're a pre-seed seed fund, which means that we're investing in the first round. We invest typically 250,000 to 500,000 Australian dollars into these companies. Then we often talk to global investors, whether the investors are based out of India, Singapore, or the US. We've co-invested with all those types of investors. And then we help them raise more money. And when we invest, we are very hands-on. So we actually don't take board seats, but we help them every fortnight or sometimes every week with how they go about building and executing. But in terms of some of the investments, to give you a sense, one of our most prominent investments right now is a company called Relevance AI. They're an agent workforce builder. If you haven't heard about them, I'd definitely check them out. They're probably a leader in building agents for enterprise customers. They're very, very complicated product. Well, not complicated, but very built out product for a mature product for where the market is at. And they've already got some very large customers on board using agents right now in a real life setting, which are reliable, and it's very exciting. And so we invested in their first round. They just raised a $15 million Series A beginning of this year, and they're cracking very well. Another successful company that we've invested in is a company called Tixel, and that is a resale marketplace for tickets. So basically, if you go to a live event and it's sold out, or you can't go and you need to resell it safely, you can basically jump on Facebook, or you can jump on Tixel, and Tixel is a safe way to do it. It's what we call an ethical marketplace, because they put price caps, so you can't gouge, you can't scalp. And so that limits their profits, but it's ethical for the consumers. And in that way, they've built a strong trust. And I like that example because they started in Australia, but they're now in the UK and the US and expanding really nicely. They're still very early stage, right? All these companies are early stage in the context of things, that we're talking about the first 5 years of the business. But nonetheless, very exciting, and they're all tracking very well. And then probably a third company I would mention is a company called Kinderworld. So it's a game studio, and so the game studio is called Lumi, and the app is called Kinderworld. You can look it up in the App Store right now. It's basically allows you to grow virtual houseplants, and I bring that up because it is so different to the Relevance AI business, right? And that's because we don't invest in market sectors. We invest in people first, and then we look at what markets they're trying to build out and create second. But in this case, it's a consumer app game, and also going very well, and very interesting new category of game.
Yeah, so your thesis is really based around those founder traits and that speed of execution, as opposed to we pick a particular industry vertical.
Yeah, correct. So we like to say interesting founders take us to interesting new markets. And I think for computer science students, it's really important to keep that in mind, because with software, you can create new markets around old industries, or you can create new segments of markets around old industries, and it's impossible to predict that. But when they see the opportunity and when they go, you know what, this is a new type of software that enables us to do this differently, while that might seem like a great technical challenge, the commercial impact of that is that, oh my God, this like totally fundamentally changes how we do something. And I think that's a really, really important power that a lot of engineers have that they don't necessarily wield unless they choose to take the entrepreneurial pathway and commercialize it themselves, to use the very university language.
Fantastic. I heard about Tixel actually in the wild the other day. I was sitting eating food at a cafe and someone was walking past me talking about, I think, selling some tickets and talking about Tixel. I quite enjoyed that. And so Relevance AI, they're building AI agents. We've obviously seen this massive explosion in AI startups. How do you think about differentiating someone who's built a GPT over the weekend from a real AI company?
It's very easy to make a cool demo. It's much harder to build a lasting company. And I think if I was to pick on anything around founders that are engineered, sometimes they get more caught up in the demo technical aspect than they do in the how do we actually translate this to a real business that is sustainable. And I think what I'm seeing right now in the market is a lot of people are using GPT or pick your language model of choice, and then go, look at this thing, I can create this, for example, a thing that books your calendar, right? I've seen demos that do this, and they're very impressive, right? They can like come in and look at your calendar and change things and optimize. But I think the thing to keep in mind there is the demo might be cool, but when put into real life, there's a lot of constraints and a lot of issues that prop up, and they're not reliable, they don't scale well, there's a lot of edge cases it doesn't deal with well, and there's a lot of issues that crop up that you don't know how to handle. And so I think these caveats is a big thing with AI right now. Like, it's a bit like those announcements people make. GPT hit this benchmark, or, oh, GPT is smarter than a surgeon. And it's like, yes, if you look at that as a specific skill and only that skill, but the caveat there is it doesn't transfer its learning. It's a test. It's not a real life situation. And you're kind of limiting everyone's sort of IQ and intelligence down to this one metric. And it's like, it doesn't make any sense. So I think it's the same with a lot of these AI products that are getting built out. Really cool demos, but very hard for me to see how it becomes a usable product at scale just yet. But nonetheless, I think it's important that people build out and keep building out these products and keep working on them, because obviously there's a lot of very exciting things happening.
So there's value and importance in tinkering, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I think that's the most important thing. Yeah. I'd encourage people to tinker more. I'd encourage people to keep tinkering. And I think when entrepreneurs find, and you might not be one, like even when students or when anyone finds an opportunity through their tinkering, the motivation to see that become a reality is more important than the business case, because if they have the motivation, they can learn the other aspects of what it requires to be, and they can understand and learn the constraints. But the tinkering is very important. So I support it. And I think one of the biggest signals to me as an investor, whether a market is very real, is how many people are tinkering in that market. And if a lot of people are tinkering in that market, you know that there's something here. And we know AI is one of those great examples. It has just ignited the imagination of so many people, technical and non-technical. And I think that's the most exciting thing. It's a real Cambrian explosion of activity.
Fantastic. And a little bit later, I'm keen to ask you a bit about the verticals that you think students should be exploring. But before then, you started Incubate at the University of Sydney. You grew it to supporting over 200 startups through the accelerator. Can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Yeah, sure. So back in 2012, I was coming to an end of graduating out of my computer science honors degree, and I was already heavily involved in, I guess, the entrepreneur startup culture on campus at the University of Sydney. I have a lot of friends that were starting startups. I was lamenting how very few people were supporting student entrepreneurs. And this still happens today. A lot of people go to university and they're entrepreneurial, but they don't get any support to start up their ventures. Now, if you're lucky and you live in one of the top 10 startup cities, and Sydney is typically considered one of the top 10 or top 12, depending on how you rank it, then there's a lot of activity and there's a lot of things changed over the last decade. So there's now a lot of activity and support, and the major universities in Sydney now will have startup programs. But back in 2012, they didn't have anything. There was literally nothing. Universities didn't even know what an entrepreneur was in a lot of ways. And one of the things I discovered was, if you're a student starting something, you're ignored by the university because all they care about is for you to get a degree and pay money to get that degree. If you're a researcher, they love you because they own your IP and they're motivated to see you do something. But often they don't like startups because startups are very risky and they prefer you to sell the IP to a big company, right? So I'm talking about Australian context here. And I thought that was really funny and bizarre. So we thought we'd start a little program just for students. And we ran a pilot, right? And we didn't think it would go anywhere. But the response was crazy. People loved it. We got some really good applications for entrepreneurs. We managed to get some funding from industry to sponsor the program. And that's really the genesis of Incubate. And then from there, it grew up to be just not a thing for students, but for alumni and for researchers. And then other universities wanted it. And then we got sponsored by Google to kind of go national. And so it really just built momentum off the back of this little pilot that we did. In 2012, to put it in context, there was really only 2 other accelerator programs worth noting that was similar that we kind of thought about when we kind of created the Incubate program at the time. And that was StartX at Stanford, again, started by students. So Stanford at the time had similar issues. Students couldn't start startups on campus due to IP restrictions. And then there was obviously Y Combinator, which is becoming more and more famous. It was still a bit niche back then in 2012, but it's now obviously everyone knows about it. It's probably the canonical Silicon Valley accelerator program. And so accelerators are becoming global dominant. So there was a few factors here that kind of helped propel this. One was that accelerators were becoming globalized. 2, higher education was starting to realize the power of entrepreneurship, and the fact that the students wanted to become entrepreneurs was a new thing for a lot of these universities. And then 3, we were just first movers, right? We decided to start this, and it built momentum. And as a result, I got very involved in higher education entrepreneurship over the years as well.
And so it kind of, I guess, your thesis around supporting student founders kind of mirrors your own career, where, like you said, you didn't wait to have a long, successful career to start an accelerator, to start a venture capital fund. It sounds like you really believe that a student entrepreneur or someone whose early career has a really strong shot at starting a successful company.
Yes, I do. In fact, I would go as far as to say the biggest companies in the world are built by first-time founders, not built by repeat entrepreneurs.
Why do you think that is?
If you look at the market capitalization today of the top 10 technology companies, right, 80 to 90% of the top 10 are started by first-time founders. So today, some of the examples of these companies are Samsung, first-time entrepreneur. Very old company, don't get me wrong, but first-time entrepreneur nonetheless. NVIDIA, first-time entrepreneur. Apple, first-time entrepreneur. Microsoft, first-time entrepreneur. Canva, first-time entrepreneur. Atlassian, first-time entrepreneur. I can keep going on, right? So what I've observed, and one of my theses, and this is what we call an emerging founder, is that there is something about a first-time entrepreneur that brings a new perspective to a market that means they're so naive that they imagine a way of doing things that other people will not imagine if they're already so experienced. And I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind. That doesn't mean they'll be successful in and itself, right? They need to surround themselves with other great people. They need to raise capital, or they need to do whatever they need to do to grow the business. But it does point out an interesting aspect. So I think our first principle is we think emerging founders create the most valuable companies. And we use that principle to look at everything. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply. Just because you're first time entrepreneur doesn't mean you're successful, but it is we think, a prerequisite. So that's what we look at. Now, there's obviously, if you've started a few companies and stuff like that, that's fine. You can keep building companies and you might be very successful. But the ones that build the biggest companies are often first-time entrepreneurs. And we think it's a combination of factors. The biggest factor, I think, for me is insight, right? So we call about what's your insight you have. And then we break that down into 3 areas. So customer, market, and technology. So insight is something unique that you know about that no one else knows about. And that's your edge. That's your strategic edge. Often first-time entrepreneurs have a technology insight, which is they know about a technology that no one else knows about, or they know about an advantage, or they just know a certain aspect. And that's an important one. And then you've got to learn about the customer insight, which is what's the unique thing you know about these customers that no one else seems to know. And then often you might develop a market insight too, which is like, what do you know about the way the market's heading no one else knows? And I find the technology insight is the most competitive advantage one, and that's the one we like to see. And so that's kind of the summary there. But that's our thesis. I think it's very hard. It's very hard to conclusively know, but it is a behavioral trait we recognize.
It's something you believe in.
Yeah, and that's our insight into entrepreneurs. A lot of people don't agree with us. Like a lot of people go. It
sounds like many VCs would disagree, right?
Absolutely. A lot of people go, I am not touching a first-time founder until they are proven, right? Customers, revenue, real team, and that's fine. But that's not what we do. We back them before they're not proven. I think that's an important aspect for us and a competitive advantage. Whether we're right or wrong, time will tell.
Time will tell. So James, you started as a software engineer at Atlassian. You studied computer science. It seems like, though, relatively quickly, once you saw some success with Incubate, you made some kind of decision that, hey, I'm probably not going to be a software engineer in my career. Can you talk me through that decision point? How did you get there?
I'm not sure if I made the decision I would be a software engineer. I think it became very clear to me where I think my superpower lies. And I think where that lies is at the intersection of people, technology, and society, I guess is probably the simple way to put it. I realized that technology is cool, but making a business and a commercial model to bring that to everyone is much cooler. And I distinctly remember working for Atlassian, as a teenager. I think maybe I was 20 when I joined. I was an intern, just to be really clear here. I wasn't like something like a full-time, like an engineer that stuck with them for years or anything like that. I just got a glimpse, and funny story how that all came about, which I can sort of dive into separately. But I just remember distinctly at the time, they said of the Fortune 500 companies, I think it was something like 80 or 70% of those companies are customers of us. And I was like, wow, isn't that cool? There's this company in Australia, and all these big global companies, around the world all use their software. And I was like, that's so interesting. And so I think what I kind of really love is that intersection. And the other aspect of me is I sort of just seem to attract entrepreneurs or end up talking to lots of entrepreneurs. It might be just something to do with the types of people I like and resonate with. But I like working with entrepreneurs. And one of the few jobs that lets you do that is venture capital. And so I thought, combining my passions of sort of technology, people, and then having an impact while helping entrepreneurs is a really easy answer. And then I was like, well, what's the best way to do that? Well, it's venture capital. However, I would there's a caveat to this, which is like starting a venture capital business is very non-traditional. Starting an incubator is very non-traditional. So I think there's other pathways that are a bit more accessible and a bit more traditional for various reasons. But that nonetheless, this is my pathway, and I think it's just how I ended up doing it. But it combines a lot of those aspects together to basically create a service where you help entrepreneurs, and that excites me. I still love that. I still love jumping on calls with entrepreneurs. 5 to 10 entrepreneurs a day for some of our periods when we're investing money into various companies, and I think it's fascinating to see, and I love it.
So you're really, you encourage the tinkering, but really what motivates you is taking it from tinkering to an idea, to a company, and taking that to market, where hopefully 70% of Fortune 500 companies end up using whoever you're supporting.
Hopefully. Yeah, it's big. It's at the core, I think there's a bit of an impact angle to me. Like, I think the most rewarding part is helping people realize their potential as leaders to build out something. And that changes people's lives. And that's like a very meaningful change. Just because they're building out a commercial product or application or consumer app doesn't change that, doesn't diminish that aspect. And I think a lot of people think about impact as being a charity. I don't think that's the case. I think with the most impact you can do is like giving people a meaningful job. And that's what entrepreneurs do. Like if they're successful, they give people a meaningful job and they let people have agency, feel like they're changing the world and have a big impact, right? Just because you're building software or a consumer product or you're researching something that's really different, cancer research is sort of by the by. Those are all value judgments about what they're doing. But like nonetheless, that action of helping people is a really, really great thing to be part of. And it's a bit of a privilege, really, to get to talk to these entrepreneurs. But it's also very tricky and tough, right? Because a lot of the times these things don't work out. And that's just the nature of the business we're in.
Really interested to unpack some of that. So you're able to apply, I guess, the technical skills that you learn studying computer science partly to just how you evaluate technical products. What are some of the other lessons that you've taken from being a technical person to your current role?
I think an appreciation of the time required to develop new technology. The one constant which is always true is entrepreneurs and technologists are overly optimistic about what stage their technology is at. Very much so. Especially if they're doing it for the first time. Like people think it's gonna, a few more fixes, a few more bug patches and I'm done. We can get this out there and we can push the product. No, it takes so long. And so I think battle tested code, which is sort of code that's in production that's being used from a software sense. It applies to hardware too, right? Electronics that are live with customers in a real setting, at scale are much better than electronics that have, on a lab that are great within a lab environment, but haven't been tested. So I think that sort of battle tested technology aspect it takes a while to get to that point. And an appreciation of that is an important aspect. That's a lesson I take too. So just understanding the cycles of iteration that used to happen before something's ready.
So it's kind of that distinction between, a solution. I can build a technological solution to someone's problem if they, approach it in the exact right way and the wind's blowing the correct way and, nothing breaks. But to actually turn it into a product that's robust, that I can throw into the hands of my users without me standing over them, telling them exactly what to do is a whole nother level of complexity.
It is. And the only way you get there is by giving it to your users to use, right? And I think that's that area, that path to overcome, that stage has to happen. And I think the only way that happens is by giving it to users to use and then going, oh, it didn't work. I got to change it. And that iterative feedback can happen really slowly or it can happen really fast. And, that depends on how much resources you have, right? And how much, sometimes most of the time this is capital. Do I have capital to hire people? And a lot of the situations that I find technologists creating things is businesses that I think could be bootstrapped. The businesses that can make money straight away from day one because people are willing to pay for that solution, that app, that whatever it does. But there are a lot of businesses that can't, that require a lot of R&D, a lot of iteration, a lot of feedback that require a lot of upfront capital to sort of get to that stage. And so that's where VC plays. But yes, that first part is really is really tricky and requires a lot of work. And I think I like to say that, a lot of what we do is fund people to make better prototypes and get them out there. And that's like kind of the stage of funding that we're in. And it's great to see because you get to see stuff when it works for the first time and stuff when it doesn't work as well. Yeah. I'm not sure that answered your question.
No, definitely does, James. You're investing in Australian companies and many of these companies are global from day one in that they're not just pursuing an Australian market. What are some of the, I guess, geographies for startups that you're really excited about?
Good question. I think Asia is very exciting. If you look at where the fastest growing startup hubs are, you kind of split between Asia and Scandinavia. And I think that's because we're all playing catch-ups. I think India has been very exciting to see. It's exploded. There's a lot of activity there. Singapore, there's been a lot of activity. Sydney and Australia generally, there's a lot of activity. Australia is one of the fastest growing startup ecosystems globally over the last 5 years. And I think these are all centers of excellence where there's a lot of interesting talent that are doing lots of interesting things. If you think about the legacy players, like the players which are already established, obviously you can look to the US and sort of San Francisco is sort of the bedrock of a lot of software and technology startups. And that's been where the revolutions happened. And I think that's still very much the center of gravity for a lot of these things. And AI has really propelled it. I think there's a period post-COVID where we thought San Francisco would die a little, well, not die, but like lose a little bit of its shine. And it definitely has, but like AI has definitely helped boost it back up again. And then obviously in Europe, London and Paris, Stockholm, Berlin, these are all other centers. So the big lesson for me, though, is going forward, technology is much more distributed. You don't need to be in San Francisco now to build a global company. You can be literally anywhere in the world. And part of our thesis in our fund, our investment, is actually this idea that anyone with a laptop and a small bit of money can build a global business from their room now. And I think AI just makes that even more possible.
So Jason Calacanis' thesis, where he will only invest in companies in Silicon Valley, you would dispute that one.
So you got to understand the context that's made in, right? If you live and invest in San Francisco, of course you're going to say you got to be in San Francisco, right? It's just there's no incentive for you to say, actually, you shouldn't. Which is why I think some entrepreneurs have come out and said, you know what? It's not just San Francisco anymore. Actually look around the world. If you look at the types of businesses these people have invested in, though, you can ask them, right? You go, how many businesses have you invested that are not from San Francisco? What percentage? And I bet you they'll say probably something like 40, 50% are not from San Francisco, And then they go, but we force them to move, or the founders have to come here to raise money or something like that, right? So I think San Francisco very much talks over, overhypes what the position is. The reality is, as an investor, there's like a trade-off. So like the number of global companies started, the density aspect is really important. So there is a very strong density within the Bay Area, which is not just San Francisco City. And I think a lot of investors, when they talk about things like that, just mean there's a strong density, and that's an advantage. And that can be an advantage for sure, but that's not a prerequisite for success. And so I think the message I guess I'd want to send to the podcast listeners is that you don't have to be in San Francisco to start a global company. You just have to start, and you may have to hire from people, and you may have to go there and raise money, or you may have to look at what's happening there, but you don't have to be there. I encourage people to go visit if they can, and I think that's an important aspect too in sort of understanding the ecosystem. But yeah, you don't have to be based there, and a lot of people are choosing not to be based there. They might go there to visit customers, they might go there to hire talent, but they don't necessarily base their head of operations there. So the world is a lot more distributed now, thanks to the internet.
And by avoiding the Bay Area, you might be avoiding some pretty high cost of living, some pretty high salary costs there.
Yeah, I think if you're a non-American company and you're very early stage and you go, I just want to be in the Bay Area, I think that's really tricky because you're competing against everyone else there. So I think you've got to make the decision to move there and base yourself there. Otherwise, I think it's much better to be aware, visit, understand the competition, talk to investors and stuff like that, but not necessarily based there. And I think the cost of operations in Asia is so much cheaper. It's a huge advantage. So use that perceived disadvantage as an advantage. Do more with less capital. And in the end, it doesn't really matter whether you're paying an engineer $500,000 or an engineer $100,000 in another country, and they're the same level of engineer, right? What really matters is, do people like what you've built, and do more people want to use it? And if you can be that person wherever you are, that's the more important goal here. It's not about, I live in San Francisco, how cool am I? No, that's not it at all. So capital efficiency is very important, and I think people underrate that. And in San Francisco, capital efficiency is terrible. To fund 2 people in a room, I need to give them at least $1 million because it costs so much to be there. To fund 2 people in a room in Singapore is expensive. In Sydney, it's pretty expensive, but it's not as bad as San Francisco. To fund 2 people room in India, orders of magnitude difference, right? So I think people could use these perceived disadvantages to their strengths.
Use your location as an advantage.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
What other advice do you have for these kind of early career or student technical founders who might be thinking like, I don't have a great network, I don't have huge experience of particular industries, you see advantage for them. What advice, how can they use that perceived disadvantage to their advantage?
So the way I would summarize this is, I think you can use being underestimated to your advantage in the way you can elicit answers from people and the way you can gain information. Information is then used as your advantage. So if you have more information than your competitors, you have an edge. And if you have an edge, you have an advantage. If you have an advantage, you can exploit that. And so I think being underestimated, right, being inexperienced, being viewed as emerging, being viewed as, not, less than maybe some other people in your space who are very experienced. I think people should use that, because I think there's a really important thing to keep in mind, which is you can use that to your advantage in the way you ask questions for very experienced people and the way you talk to them. And you can almost, in some ways, get them to tell you what they truly think about things and what they are seeing in the market, and get them to give you good feedback and advice, if that makes sense, and then take that on board. And I think the thing I like to say is, like, a startup with two people, or an entrepreneur with two people, that's just starting out, is playing a very different game to someone like an Elon Musk, right? And I think the thing that a lot of newbie entrepreneurs, the thing that they get wrong is they're not Elon Musk. They shouldn't be adopting the traits of Elon Musk. They're not playing the game of a billionaire that has all the money in the world he needs, that has all the resources in the world he needs. They're playing the game as someone that has no resources and no money. And that game is a different game. And I think in that regard, you can use that to your advantage by talking to people, getting advice from people, and reaching out to people. And you can, and I'm a big fan of cold outreach, as when from our time at the incubator and stuff together. But like, cold outreach, getting advice from people that know it, is really important. I'll give you an example, right? A lot of startups really hate the fundraising process. They don't like talking in VCs and getting rejected. What I recommend, these are the other way around. By statistically, not everyone's going to invest in your business. That only a small percentage of investors you meet will invest. So usually the other way around, when you meet an investor that meets lots of startups, right? I meet startups every single day, right? I know what's happening in a lot of sectors because I meet them all. I meet the people building it. Talk to them, understand, ask them, what are you seeing? How do I sit in the market? What am I doing unique? Use it as a free consulting session. And guess what? The VCs love that. You tell a VC, oh, you're so experienced and wise. They love it. They'll talk for hours. And so you can flip that around and go, okay, tell me what's the best thing you see? What's the thing you see that you'll absolutely want to invest in straight away, right? And I think getting that information is really important, is more important than necessarily being like, I'm getting told no again. That's annoying. Boo-hoo. But so I think that's the way. And it's the same for customers, right? If you are trying to get a big customer and you don't have any customers, cold outreaching to CEOs and just being like, you know what? I am a new entrepreneur. I've built this thing. It's pretty cool. I think you guys will like it, but I'd love some feedback. You'd be surprised how far that type of email goes as a young entrepreneur that you simply can't do when you're an experienced entrepreneur in your 50s. You just can't do that, right? The CEO will be like, piss off, you're like trying to screw me or something like that. You're trying to scam me. But as a young entrepreneur, you can be like, I'm a young entrepreneur. I'm a 21-year-old. I've built this thing. I guarantee you, most CEOs will be like, you know what? We'll take a look. They'll CC you into their senior executive. They'll have a look. They can give you some feedback. So I think again, using these things as an advantage is really important. Discovering how to do that is the hard thing.
So that naivety or inexperience can open doors where people might close doors to other founders.
That's a good way of summarizing. That's a much more elegant way of saying it. Yeah, that's correct.
Nice. So many of our listeners, they're students, they're studying programming, they're thinking about, where does my career take me? What are you seeing are the technical skills most in demand for startups? Should students be thinking about specializing at this point?
If you're naturally curious about this topic and you want to dive deep, right? Trying to artificially engineer your career is also a formula for failure. Because if you do all these things just because you think it's the right thing to do, but none of them you care about, then that's also not good. Just being a software engineer and loving to code is more important than just being like, I've just got to learn the raw skills of computer science. I've got to understand all the fundamental topics. And so I would encourage young software engineers to get involved in projects. So whether that's contributing to open source or whether that's working for someone, I think getting involved earlier with code that's in production is very important. But equally, if you want to become a research scientist, right, and study computer science and specialize in a certain topic, I think that's fine as well. The thing I would sort of mention, if you sort of think about the top like areas that people are thinking of getting into, obviously large language models is interesting, but in some ways we're already too late. Like if you're just starting your research career, I would encourage you to think about getting into what's next beyond large language models. That's not the end and be all of AI. So if you want to be in AI, I'd encourage you to kind of think about, well, what's the models after LLMs? Because there will be ones. LLMs are not the be all and end all. And I think there's already discussions about that, and there's already a lot of exciting work. So I think putting yourself in that place with other people who are the leader in those aspects is more important than necessarily kind of just going, I'm just going to pick a particular skill. If you were to ask me like more around like what investors think are really interesting, I think the areas that are really interesting to me obviously are sort of AI related. I think synthetic bio, AI and bio, intersection of biomedicine are very interesting. I think climate-related technologies is very interesting, but very broad. And I think deep tech is very interesting. You know, software is becoming more and more of a commodity as the language of computers becomes spoken language. And we are heading to that point over the next 5 decades where the language of computers will be our language, will not be code. And so I think that's really exciting. That doesn't mean computer science is like irrelevant. I do not think that. Like, I think if you're studying computer science, I think you're in a very strong position. We need more engineers, but I would encourage people to think about, you know, where the puck is going, not where it's at, depending on what they're interested in, and go to those edges of the forest, I call it. You know, so whatever you're interested in, go to the edge of the forest of what you're interested in, because that's where the interesting stuff's happening. And that's what I would encourage people to take away.
Edge of the forest. So look for those, I guess, those elements of your interest that the people are only just beginning to explore, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, let's say you want to study, let's say you love statistical analysis or stats and maths and AI research. Cool. You could become an LLM researcher, which is fine. But you could, if you want to do research, I encourage you to go, well, who are the research groups doing the next iteration of models? And there's tons of them, right? There's quite a few exciting groups out there looking at various approaches that are not simply LLMs. For example, you know, one of the most outspoken critics of AI regulation is literally one of the godfathers of transformers, which is Yann LeCun, who's a very outspoken French man who lives in America. Researcher. He's the lead researcher for AI at Meta. For those of you who don't know, you can look him up. And he spent a lot of time recently talking about what's beyond language models, right? What do we need to really get to true intelligent artificial intelligence? And he thinks it's not LLMs, it's going to be the next iteration. And he's already talking about that. And then there's a lot of other things in research which are trying to map the neurological activity of the brain more closely, and things like that. But that's just one example in AI. You know, if you think about synthetic biology, there's a lot of examples there. So I think that the tricky part for a young entrepreneur, depending where they're at, is sort of finding out where these groups of activity are happening. But you can do your research these days and come up with some areas and researchers that are doing things. And again, use your naivety, reach out to these people, go talk to them. Like, these people are happy to jump on a Zoom call. The best thing about COVID is like jumping on a Zoom call to talk to people is not weird anymore. And I think people can use that advantage.
Yeah, fantastic. So being able to find, I guess, the areas that are emerging, that are exciting. If I then think about applying that to, I'm coming out of university or I'm coming out of study, looking for my first job, and I have a bunch of options open to me. I can go work for a big company. I can try work for a startup. I don't know whether I want to work in this team that's building this internal tool at, you know, a great tech scale up versus like, do I pick a tiny scrappy startup where I'm not sure if it'll be around in a year's time? What's a model for making that kind of decision, and how would you pick the the edge of the forest in those scenarios?
Yeah. So there's two modes that I'll talk about here. One mode is you already know what topic you're interested in. And if you already know what topic you're interested in, I think it's much easier to find out what the edge of the forest is. You got to do your research. You got to have a global search. Think of yourself as like an investment analyst almost, and imagine you have $1 million to invest in this space. So where would I put $1 million if I had to make a bet? And then do your research to find the research groups or the products or the companies that are doing the stuff that you'd be like, I would invest $1 million in what they're doing. If you get to that mindset and that conclusion, I think you're getting onto the right pathway. And then when you meet those people, you ask them, who else should I know in this space? And then they'll tell you, right? And then it's usually a very small group of people. Almost always it's a small group. In technology, it's amazing how a small group of 10 people globally will be at the forefront of something that changes the impact for the rest of us. That's just the way the world works. It's very fascinating. I won't talk about that right now, but it's technological ways. It's very fascinating. So if you already know what you want to do, that's the way I take that mindset. If you don't know what you want to do, I take the hill climbing algorithm mindset, which some of you in computer science will already know. But the hill climbing algorithm is how do you know what is the top of the hill? So imagine you're at the bottom of a hill, of a lot of hills. There's cloud covering the top of them, and you don't know which one is the top, the peak. And the peak represents the thing that you're most interested in or the achievement that you want to make. So you basically don't know the path. Turns out the most optimal path right now is to drop yourself randomly in various parts of the terrain and just start walking. And you'll start to figure it out, essentially, right? Rather than try and over-optimize to go, maybe it's this hill, or maybe this hill, and we will plan various hills. And so what I recommend for people that don't know is to literally try lots of things. And you will discover very quickly the things you think are really boring and the things that you absolutely love. The trick is, if you discover something you don't like is really boring, move on quickly. Don't try and force yourself to like it. And I think this is where people fall down a little bit. They go, oh, I've got to stay at this job for this long, or oh, I've started this PhD, I better just do it. No, just move on. Because I think when you're younger, you have the biggest optionality. As you get older, your optionality decreases based on your life situation. As you're younger, your optionalities increase. Take advantage of optionality. Jump is what I recommend. So do the random walk. Randomly do something. Pick something. Flip a coin. Do the thing that you're not sure about, right? And then if you don't like it, do the next thing. And I think what people discover is they'll learn a lot more doing many things and then working out what to hone in on than they will just focusing on one thing that they don't really like.
And it sounds like, some of your advice from before around not trying to overplan your career really applies here, where there might be a failure mode where you have this picture of what the top of the mountain is, and then you get there and you realize it's not right for you. But
correct.
You've invested all this time and energy into this one idea of what you see yourself being, and maybe there's a part of you that doesn't want to throw away that time investment.
Yeah, correct. It's the classic sunk cost fallacy. And I think that applies. Yeah. And sunk cost fallacy, for those that don't know, is this fallacy where you go, I've already invested all this money, all this time, I better just keep going. Whereas in reality, they should cut losses and just move on. It's like companies where they keep working on a product that everyone hates and no one uses, and they really should just let it go. But they refuse to because they've spent so much time and money, and it's harder to change the boat sometimes. And so I think the thing I would take, the agile programming approach to your career applies as much as that, which is don't be afraid to be quite iterative and keep moving and try new things if you haven't found something that you like. In some ways, I'm the opposite, right? I found something I really loved and was passionate about, which is helping entrepreneurs, and that's what I've been doing. But equally, I think for someone who hasn't found something, then I think it's much better to try lots of things until they find something they really like, and then go from there. And I think it just depends. Everyone's pathway is unique, so it's hard to generalize these things. But that's kind of the two modes I would kind of roughly bucket it into.
Fantastic advice, James. If our listeners want to find out more about what you're up to and about Galileo, how can they stay in touch?
Yeah, so I've launched a new Substack newsletter, for better or for worse, which is called VC Down Under. So people can subscribe to that. It's very new. I've literally just launched it. So, if by the time you hear this, you'll probably see the first few posts up there. But if you're interested in what I'm doing and basically my views on investing in startups, it's really aimed at founders and investors. So that's the audience. But I think people that are interested in that space are very happy to subscribe. Galileo Ventures is our fund. If you've got a startup idea you want to pitch us, by all means, please do. We give feedback to everyone that approaches us, even if we don't invest. So just mention that you heard me on this podcast, and we'll make sure to have a look and give you some feedback. And we run a lot of events. We have a newsletter that goes out every month, so people can subscribe to that if they want. But otherwise, those are probably the two main channels. My parting message would be, for people thinking about starting a startup, just start one. We're the best time in humanity to be an entrepreneur right now. It's the recognition, the resources you have, you can dispose of, the amount of productivity, the amount of things you can do with very little is just incredible right now with technology. So I encourage all of you to take advantage of it, whether you start your own business or help someone else or in a research lab. I think, I encourage people to just take advantage of what technologies they have available to them at this stage.
There's never been a better time.
That's right.
James Alexander, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Love talking to you, and excited to hear from the listeners.
You've been listening to Programmable, a podcast by JDoodle. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, James.